Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Village Boy podcast. On this episode, we're piggybacking from the last edition where we talked about H-1B visa, a guest worker program, essentially. And we're going to broaden the scope on the guest worker program in the United States. We're going to start with the genesis of the guest worker program. So, the genesis of the guest worker program, by my account, was the founding fathers. I don't know how we call them founding fathers because the country was already founded and inhabited by people. But we're going to, for context purposes, we're going to say the founding fathers. When the colonial masters and founding fathers arrived in America, and they figured that this was a fertile land, this land was blessed, and they wanted to cultivate this land and they wanted to grow and turn this country into a prosperous nation endowed by God from their own estimations. They figure out they were supposed to get labor because they were not able to do the work themselves. And this was the introduction of the first guest worker program or the first H-1B visa. It was not called H-1B visa at the time. It was not called a guest worker program, but essentially this was the concept. This was where every other program came out of. We'll watch this video and try to understand a little bit about the context of the original guest worker program.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world.
It said it forcefully brought Africans, over 10 million Africans, to the Americas forcefully. So the Africans did not come of their own volitions. They did not say, we want to go to America and work. So by this estimation, we can say that the only 2 people in America who are here, not out of free will, not out of their personal decision to come here, are the Aboriginal Americans who were the natives. We call Native Americans because this was their land. They were found here. And the Black African Americans who were wrestled out of Africa, forced out of their homes and brought to America. They did not say, I want to go to America to go look for work. I want to go to America for greener pastures. I want to, because every other person in America today came to America out of free will. I want to go to America for work. Whatever kind of work, it was your choice, your decision to make that you made, that you wanted to travel to America for a better life for yourself and your family, for greener pastures, for the American dreams. The only 2 people that never made that decision were the Aboriginal Americans, the indigenous people of America, the native population. And why do we call them Indians? Because the Europeans who came, I'm sure they were looking for a route to Europe, to India, and they got lost and found themselves in the Americas. And they found these people here that looked like India, which means they had already been to India. But at the time, there was no GPS that would make you know your route every time you're going. So I'm sure somewhere they missed the coast or tide or wave rerouted them, and they found themselves in the Americas. And they saw a people that looked like the people in India, and they said Indians, native Indians. And that's how come the name came to stay. That's my estimation. I am not, this is not scientific. It's just my estimation on this podcast. And so these 2 groups of people are the only groups that find themselves in America without free will. The Aboriginals and the people that were brought from Africa
Of
as
contact
slaves.
between
Let's
Europe
keep
and
watching.
Africa via the Mediterranean. But the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa.
So the work was labor intensive, and the settlers did not have the power, the capacity to meet that demand. These are European people. They did not go back to Europe and say, hey, we found this new lands. We want to grow sugarcane, cotton. It's labor intensive. We need the poorest of the poor Europeans. They could have got European people. They could have just gone back home and picked up European people in ships and brought them out to work. Pay them, not pay them. But they did not do none of that. They left, went past Europe, went directly to Africa because before they found America, they had been trading with Africa. So they knew that there were people on that continent and they were very powerful. And it gets interesting from here on out because you can see how the Europeans, the settlers, did not value their own people in Europe to do this manual work. And you could then correlate that throughout history, the Europeans have not valued Europeans to do a certain amount of manual labor. Because in other episodes, we will see that when there's always a labor shortage, we are not rushing to Europe to bring people from there to do farm work, to do menial jobs, cleaning, nanny. They don't do that. Europeans are good for industrial work, intellectual work, and that kind of work. Now, so these people had found that they needed labor. They could have gone home. They didn't do that. They decided to route themselves to Africa to find the labor force that they needed. And
Slavery
let's
had
talk about
existed for
how that
centuries
came
in
about.
various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. Viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from.
So let's talk about this. For as long as I've existed, they've always taught us that the Europeans came and got into Africa and conquered Africa and stole our brothers and sisters. This little video tells us that that is all BS and it was never true. This makes a lot of sense than that because the Europeans would never have lasted in Africa with all the disease, mosquitoes, yellow fever, and everything that was in Africa at the time. They would not have survived. So what happened is that, like the video just said, they knew that Africans were conquering other African villages and African kingdoms were fighting one another. And when I win your kingdom, when my kingdom dominates yours and wins yours, we are going to capture your people. The men were usually killed. The women and children were kept as slave or domestic servants. A few men were also kept as slave, but the women and children were kept as domestic servants. So if the men were getting killed and wasted away, and the Europeans came and said, hey, don't kill them anymore, right? I mean, the prisons are filling up. Don't kill them. I'll take them off your hands. I'll take them to go do work. So I'll give you weapons. I'll give you rum. I'll give you all of this stuff. Just the trade-off is give me your prisoners, the people. And these people, the prisoners they were prisoners of war. They were not essentially like they had committed crimes or they were criminals. They were just prisoners of war. We conquered your countries and the men were captured and then kept in jails and eventually sold off. And because it became a very lucrative business, the women and children also were shipped off. And so for the longest time, they've told us that the scenario was that the white man came and suppressed the African kings. That narrative didn't really make sense. This narrative that it was a free revolution, the kings sold out their prisoners and their captives to the white men in exchange for rum and gunpowder so that they can then dominate other Africans make more sense. I don't think that the kings knew that these people were going to get tortured and dehumanized in America. I don't think that the deal was on the table, and I don't even think that they cared. They saw them as people that were getting shipped off, and I don't think that
from
they
the slave
really
trade,
cared.
but meeting
Let's
the
keep watching.
Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare. But the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact.
And so you can see, and like I said at the beginning, these Europeans had the option. They're from Europe. They had a population, they had the rich, they had the poor. Not everybody in Europe was rich. They had the destitute. They had all kinds of people in Europe. The Europeans could have gone to Europe and pulled out their brothers and sisters and brought them to the Americas and work. But the Europeans never felt their brothers and sisters had the physical capacity to do the work, or they saw their brothers and sisters as superior to the work that was needed. And if you look at throughout the history of guest worker programs, you might be inclined to say, are they not people in Europe that can work farms? Are they not people across Europe that can do dirty jobs? But that's usually not the case. Brown and Black people have typically being sourced to do this kind of physical work. And since slavery, America generally has not looked to Africa for any kind of labor. America has generally just turned to the brown part of the world, either Asia or Latin America, from Mexico to Central and South America, still constituting more brown people to do some of this kind of work. And again, this was the birth of the guest worker program. We have some kind of job that we need to do, and we need to go out there and get the kind of people that are befitting of these jobs, right? This low level kind of jobs. So it is the history and legacy over time. And like I said, the people are always going to come here. I mean, post slavery, when now people are getting paid, but the jobs are still as bad. We're going to touch up on a program in a later episode, the Basero program, which brought in Mexicans to work in California farms post World War II. So, guys, this is the end of this episode. If you like the content, if you're having value from this video, please like and subscribe so that we have the ability to keep creating videos as this. There's so much more. There's so many guest programs that we're going to touch on, and we're going to look at why specifically brown and black people are targeted for such jobs. Thank you.